On June the 7th, 2017, the greater Knysna area along the garden route was ravaged by the most devastating natural disaster in 150 years. Built by the sea, around a lagoon, and encircled by hills, the coastal town of over 75,000 inhabitants was trapped on all sides by blazes raging across a 100-kilometre radius. The inferno spread across the bush, charring the countryside, decimating the wildlife and into the town itself, reducing streets and suburbs to smouldering, scorched shells. 7 people died, hundreds of homes were destroyed, and thousands of residents displaced. And now that the ash has settled, questions arise. Was the response too little, too late? And will the recovering town be able to survive another disaster? July the 7th, the start of Knysna's annual Oyster Festival, the town's largest event consisting of a week filled with festivities, food, fitness and fun. On the surface, it seems to be business as usual.
Knysna needs economic investment and support now more than ever. We need to say very clearly to investors and visitors that the town is open for business. We've got clean water, we've restored most of the public services, life is returning to normality in inverted commas, right? And the whole hashtag Knysna Rise is about us looking at this resilience and this enormous community spirit to help rebuild.
And indeed, in the aftermath of the devastation, the prevailing attitude is overwhelmingly of revival and hope in the wake of horror and loss. 10,000 residents were successfully evacuated, with firefighters, disaster management teams, municipal officials and volunteers providing rescue and relief around the clock.
We managed to save lives. Tragically, 7 people were killed, but it could have been a lot worse. Tens, if not hundreds of people could have been killed. And we managed to evacuate people. We managed to make arrangements to temporarily house people, to get food to people, to get water, clothes. And this crisis went on for, people don't possibly realize, for about a week. We had most of the town, most of the damaged areas back up and running within a week in terms of water and electricity.
But a long and painful road to recovery lies ahead. 2 months after the inferno, much of Knysna is still shell-shocked, in a state of post-traumatic stress. Even driving into town, one can smell and almost taste the destruction. It's like witnessing the aftermath of relentless yet random mortar attacks.
It's just, you can't, it's inexplicable. I've tried to explain to my family who've been very concerned, in Joburg and so on. And they're upset and they're happy I'm okay and they're helping, in all kinds of ways, talking and everything. They just can't understand, put them in, show them the movie kind of thing to say this is what it was like, but you can't.
The fire damaged 25 tourist establishments and 2,500 jobs were lost.
For a town of this size, that is a massive number. These are people who worked for people whose property were destroyed, or for businesses.
In South Africa, fires are a common hazard, particularly in overcrowded informal settlements. In the Knysna fire, 150 shacks were destroyed.
As a one who grew up and born in this place, I'd never see a fire like that. That never happened before. We've got small fires, but the firefighters can control it. But that one was very, very, very. They talk on loudspeakers that we must get out of our houses, so we start running, get out as much as we can from our properties, and we just put it on the road there and we stay at the road there.
Those 150 informal settlements, what can we do next? And that it'll be probably to look at the first phase of providing service sites to them and over the longer term to look at, providing permanent housing.
The plan is they said they are going to build RDP houses, so RDP houses are very safe from the shocks we are used to live with.
But fires are equal opportunity disasters, discriminating neither between species, race, class or age. And what differentiates the Knysna disaster from other fires affecting the country is the profile of its principal victims.
I can't think of another disaster certainly in modern South African history where the vast majority of the victims are white middle class by and large.
There are about 1,191 houses, which are formal houses, that were affected. Some of them totally razed to the ground, others which have been significantly damaged. The general sort of notion is, rich people can take care of themselves, etc., or middle-income people can take care of themselves. It's not true in a disaster. In fact, in some way, it is a kind of equalizing factor.
And fire survivors like Struan Law continue to relive the trauma. A widowed father of 3, he had lived in this house in Belvedere for 21 years, living a simple life, surviving off the grid and running a small business delivering firewood. His wife died last year and he was forced to raise his young sons and daughter alone. But in a moment, everything he had built up in 21 years went up in flames.
The children in the province had the day off school because of the severe weather conditions. They were at home with me and I was preparing to deliver firewood. My little boys desperately needed to get to town to buy a spinning top. So I loaded the van with the delivery and called them, and we all went off to town. But I had seen the flames and the fire and the smoke and knew that I had to get back. I couldn't take long. The traffic was bumper to bumper. We couldn't go anywhere. I sat there for about 5 minutes wondering what to do while Belvedere and Brenton was burning. Eventually I pulled out into the oncoming traffic and followed an ambulance in the oncoming traffic lane all the way to my turn off. There were flames everywhere and it was clearly a dangerous place to be. I probably ought to have stopped right there and turned around, but I carried on. I stopped the car and I said to the children, "Shall we go in?" And they said to me, "No, you can't go in there." So we drove on, went up the road to a viewpoint. We stayed up there for 2 hours, and I said to them, "When we go back, you must understand that there's nothing left there."
I'm amazed. It's in one piece. Can you believe it?
Sifting through the rubble, searching to retrieve bittersweet fragments of moments, memories, identity.
Things start to hit you, first of all, like everything's gone. My car was a big thing, my bikes. Those were the big things I was thinking of. Then I started thinking of everything. It was just, and then your material things, your clothes, your books. I was worried about my library books, like those things. And then after that, it comes in waves, because after that, the emotional stuff, the sentimental stuff started hitting me, and I started thinking about my children's drawings and my mother's jewelry and the necklace my son bought me, and the things you just absolutely can't replace.
Nadine Page is another Knysna fire survivor who lost everything in the fire. She miraculously escaped, but without even the clothes on her back.
It was boiling hot, and my bedroom actually got the afternoon sun. It was always hot anyway, and that particular day, because of the the Bergwins and the fires, obviously. It was very hot. So I took my shirt off and I was just lying on the bed. So then I woke to my phone ringing, and that woke me, so I got up. So I answered, and my landlord said to me, "Are you at home?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, leave." So I said, "Oh, okay, let me just go and have a look." When I looked down, I could see flames from the bottom of the house. So I ran up the stairs to the deck to go back inside the house to grab my bag and shoes and shirt and whatever I could, keys. And as I got to the kitchen door, the big gas bottle that was under my lounge, which was serving the place underneath me, just exploded like a bomb. And the lounge window shut out, so there was glass flying everywhere and just flames everywhere. I froze. I really did, you know. And then I thought, no, move, you know. Then I realized I wasn't going to be able to get anything, and I turned and ran. And I had to climb over like a barbed wire fence and then a wall. I remember thinking at one point when I had to climb over the wall, I don't know what to do with my phone because I had it in my hand. And normally I put it in like a bra, you know, because I'm not going to climb over the wall. I wasn't wearing one. So and then I was like under my chin, under my arm, what am I going to do, you know? So I eventually just held it, and I wanted to keep it safe because I knew I needed it, you know? And so I just held it, and I sort of like got to the top of the wall and I rolled because there was like an embankment, a sand embankment that went down from the bottom of the wall. So I just like sort of tucked and rolled and like, okay, my phone's safe. And then I got down to the street. And as I got down to the street, I immediately tried a phone because I knew I was in huge danger now, because now I was watching embers. The palm trees were sending dry, floating embers. And I would watch one land on the house and the house gone up. And all these gas bottles, they were just all exploding like bombs around me.
Much of it is a blur how she finally made it to safety, several streets from her home. But after 2 hours of frantically trying to make contact with emergency services while making her way through the flames, she was finally rescued.
So when I got into the car, the first thing I said was, "I'm not wearing a shirt." And he was, "I know, but it doesn't matter, I don't care." And he gave me his jacket.
After recovering from a painful divorce, the death of her mother, and losing her job, Nadine had rented a house in Knysna Heights, ready for a new beginning.
I got settled and put my mum's furniture in, and I was fine.
But Knysna Heights was the hardest hit suburb, with as many as 200 homes ravaged by the fire. The source of the destruction was primarily alien trees transformed into lethal missiles. Yet in the midst of gutted streets, some homes would stand miraculously untouched.
There are so many fire dynamics that I keep hearing more and more about. The one thing is the projectiles. The other thing is that a large amount of the aliens were thin stem, basically as thick as your finger, which is kindling, which means that just a fire moves through them very quickly, very easily. If it comes to your garden, it's just going to go through your garden. People are going to have to look at the design of their houses. We heard, for example, plastic guttering might have been a huge problem because it melts like petrol, drips down. Then there are other things like, for example, the combination of the heat coming up from the fire and a strong wind means that the heat came through the area like a wave, grabbing the one house, missing the next one. It was literally a firestorm.
This speeded up CCTV camera footage shows how a fire can spread within seconds. And for Nadine, like hundreds of other Knysna residents, the initial euphoria of survival soon translated into trauma.
I was a gibbering wreck. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I was fed like a baby my first meal that I managed to keep down because my hand was shaking and I couldn't lift the spoon like that.
Although she has the emotional support of her partner, Stuart Crisford, like Stu-in-law, a widowed father of 3 who also lost everything in the fire, she is now dependent on friends and charity for clothing, food and accommodation.
We're not used to accepting charity, and I found it very difficult. And I had no clothes. I was wearing men's clothes, shoes 2 sizes too big, and I had no clothes. But I still, my friend took me there, and I sat in the car and I said, I can't walk in there, but she dragged me in. And then I just did get into that kind of thing where I could see people were so giving and were so wanting to, you know, and you have to accept the help because you're just helpless.
People who I've never met before have called me up and been very generous. I think this touches people's hearts. Every day there's relief centres handing out food and clothes.
The Western Cape government has channelled 75 million rand towards rebuilding efforts for the fire survivors. Companies, banks and various sectors of society have also contributed to the recovery efforts.
I want to put that 75 million in context because we've had a number of pledges of help from government, different other spheres of government, and from private donors. The 75 million that you're referring to was pledged by the provincial cabinet. That is also to include Plet and I believe other areas affected by the disaster. So exactly how much of that will ultimately come to Knysna remains to be seen.
It's not that we feel entitled to help from the municipality, but we know that the donations have been massive and that is meant for the victims.
People have this idea that money has flooded in. At last count, it's just over R1 million sitting in our bank account. None of it has been spent yet. We have set up a ring-fenced account that will be properly monitored, controlled and administered by an independent auditing firm. So it'll be completely accountable in terms of what that money ultimately gets spent on. And in the council resolution that set up that mechanism, it was to include infrastructure, humanitarian help, environmental regeneration, etc.
And one of the most shocking revelations is that among the hundreds of homeowners whose properties were destroyed, many had no insurance.
Of that 1,191 homes, about 439, we understand, have been insured. Now, there are about 752 homes that have been uninsured. And that's what we're told. We'll still verify the numbers and so on. But whatever that number is, if you own a house in the region of R1 million or 2 million rands, your life savings are gone in there and it's uninsured, you immediately lose that asset and you're classed in the region of being, asset poor.
The whole insurance issue is one that we're also going to be hearing a lot about for a long time to come. There were people who were not insured, and that's in the hundreds. There were people who are underinsured. There were even people who, as far as they were concerned, were insured adequately or properly, but subsequently, when they put claims in, they've been informed by the insurance companies that because of this or that or the next thing, in terms of this technicality or that small print, they actually didn't have the insurance cover that they thought they had, and only a percentage of the claim is going to be paid out. Now that is still being grappled with at the moment, and that is devastating.
Neither Nadine nor Struan owned the houses they were living in, but neither of them have household insurance or any cover for personal effects. Now they both have to start their lives from scratch. Like its predecessor, Knysna's most devastating fire in 150 years was a disaster waiting to happen. On the morning of June the 7th, a raging fire had been reported in the east of Knysna, in Kreisfontein, near Plettenberg Bay. But by afternoon, the fires from the west, in over 20 locations, were being swept towards the town, stoked by the gale force winds that wreaked havoc on the Cape Peninsula.
There were severe weather warnings put out by the provincial government. They saw a weather pattern developing which I believe was unprecedented in modern era, or since records began, in terms of the severity of the storm. So we were expecting very high winds and probably a lot of rain, if anything, but certainly not fires.
The fire was driven by searing berg winds, gusting at up to 100 kilometers an hour. At one stage, the fire was moving a kilometer every 10 minutes.
It was climatic conditions, not only at the time, but the days and weeks before that time. It was the location of developments directly in the natural fire path. It was a combination of exotic plantations, fynbos, open spaces with uncontrolled vegetation on it. Very hot, very strong winds. So many different conditions played a role to make this horrible, horrible, disastrous fire.
But it had begun weeks before as smouldering underground blazes along the garden route. It flared in Elandskraal near Sedgefield and in Renendal, rapidly spreading to Buffalo Bay and then into Knysna. And its strength had been stoked by the drought-stricken vegetation.
The few years of drought has meant that the forest floor, which is usually moist with wet leaves, has dried. And usually when a spark falls there, it'll just die. And this time, because of the dry leaves, a spark would fall and it'll just smolder for weeks, maybe even months.
All these conditions made for the perfect firestorm. But there were warning signs weeks before, and eyewitnesses who spotted the growing pall of smoke and flames long before Knysna was ravaged accused the municipality of doing too little too late.
A municipality the size of Knysna's has limited resources. To start off with, I think our total complement in our fire department is 30 people on 3 shifts. At any one time there are 9 fire people, 1 fire chief, and I think about 4 vehicles. That's it.
I really think this was too fast, too big, too traumatic. I think it was just out of the scale of the event.
An examination of the trajectory of the fire shows how it cut a swath through the alien foliage growing alongside Knysna's indigenous forests, forming 2 main fronts along the suburbs of Belvedere, Brenton-on-Sea and Brenton-on-Lake on the one side, and on the other side the areas included Eastford, Narnia, Knysna Heights, White Location and Fisherhaven.
I think at very high level we're going to have to look at landscape changes, distances between the plantations, what happens between, like stepping stones for a fire to jump from one plantation to the other, where we redevelop, how do we secure those developments from a fire like this that just literally went from one patch of vegetation to the next.
Eventually, a ring of fire circled the entire town, blocking all exits. And 2 months after the disaster, fires are still smouldering in the hills.
Every one of those will have to be paid attention to. This is why I also mentioned that every firefighting equipment you have, you're going to need. Sometimes it's a little fire that much. You might need to dig underground and put it out. There are underground fires because of the mulch that's underground. Every one of them is a bit of a risk. And we're going to have to keep our fingers on this fire still for another few months to come.
Where lush bush and trees once stood, the surrounding countryside is blackened and bald, and after being battered by 2 of nature's fiercest elements, fire and wind, will Knysna be able to withstand another storm, this time unleashed by water, winter rains and earth in the form of mudslides, further devastating the already disfigured town?
Now, that's probably our biggest environmental risk at the moment. When the fire raged through, the national park and most of the national indigenous forest was very little damage to it. But our risk happens now after the fire. A lot of these slopes very close to the estuary are now denuded of vegetation. If we have a strong rainfall now, a lot of that could wash in and into the estuary. And this estuary is extremely important with regard to the biodiversity. In this case, that biodiversity also has an economic value.
What is clear is that the fire has been a major wake-up call for the entire garden route, and Knysna's disaster management strategies will have to dramatically change.
There's a massive project that needs to be undertaken here. I have no doubt that we will be able to do that.
Rebuilding the town is possible. Rebuilding individual lives requires a special kind of resilience.
It's a starting all over. It's shedding my past, everything. It's a fresh start. So it is in a way liberating, but it's very scary. I think the worst is the fear of the future, because I don't know what it holds.
My little girl refers to the day the dragon came through and wiped out all of Knysna. So they They've got a good sense of humor. I can only say that children are resilient. If you fill their life with love and security, I only hope that that's enough. There's a lot of support that those who have been affected by this fire have received. There's still a lot more support that they need. I think I'm really one of the very fortunate individuals. There's people who are in worse positions, but we need to be positive. Everybody needs to look to the light.